It had only been 3 hours since my son-in-law left on a business trip when my granddaughter came home from school with her eyes swollen from crying so much. She barely whispered to me, "Grandma, get me out of here. I'm afraid of Dad." When we got to my house, she handed me a recording. When I listened to it, my legs gave out. It turns out that all this time, my son-in-law, I'm glad you're here. If you're watching this video, please subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're listening to my revenge story from. I want to know how far it has reached. I was walking down the same old cobblestone street with the heavy grocery basket in my hand. It was barely 9 in the morning, and the sun was already starting to beat down, making sweat bead on my forehead. I was going to Emily's house, my daughter, who lives just 3 blocks from my house. The wooden door of her house creaked a little when I pushed it open. The house was silent. Only the hum of the ceiling fan could be heard. Daniel, my son-in-law, was standing in the middle of the living room in his immaculate business suit and perfectly combed hair. His familiar black suitcase was next to the sofa, as if it were ready to go. He looked at me and gave me one of those forced smiles that never seemed sincere to me. "Linda, please take care of the house and pick up Sarah these days. I'm leaving on a business trip. I'm sure it will take me a few days to get back," he said with a haste that betrayed his desire to end the conversation. I nodded, already used to this scene. Daniel traveled often for work, and since Emily was buried in her responsibilities, they often left Sarah, my little granddaughter, home alone. Sarah is only 10 years old. She is the daughter of Emily and Michael, her first husband. I'm sure by this time she had already gone to school early, like every day. I asked him a couple of questions about what he would leave for Sarah to eat, and took the opportunity to ask him about Emily to see if she had been less stressed with work lately, but Daniel only answered in monosyllables, glancing at his watch. "The taxi is already waiting for me outside. I'm leaving now," he said as he dragged the suitcase, which made a little noise on the floor. I walked him to the door and watched as the taxi disappeared at the end of the little street. I went back inside, closed the door, and tried to get those silly ideas out of my head. The house was tidy, but I still started cleaning the kitchen. The breakfast dishes were still piled in the sink, and there were a couple of Sarah's shirts mixed in the laundry basket. I gathered everything, put it in the wash, and opened the windows to air it out. Around noon, I sat down to rest on the sofa with a glass of ice-cold lemonade. The image of Sarah came to my mind. That girl was my greatest joy, with her radiant smile and bright eyes. Every time I picked her up from school, I felt my soul lighten. It was as if my own youth returned with every story she told me. But lately I had noticed that Sarah spoke less, and her smiles were becoming scarcer. I told myself that maybe it was because she was growing up, or because she still wasn't used to Daniel. In any case, the girl still loved Michael, her biological father, very much, although he no longer appeared much in Emily and her life. In the afternoon, I took my cloth bag and walked to the elementary school. The school gate was a hive of activity, with parents crowded together and the murmur of children sounding like a flock of sparrows. I stood on a corner, my eyes fixed on the river of children pouring out the door. The other kids ran and jumped, showing off their grades to their parents, laughing and chatting excitedly. But I waited, and Sarah didn't appear. I started to feel a knot in my stomach. I stood on my tiptoes, trying to see over the crowd. Finally, I saw her come out last of all. Her heavy backpack hung from one shoulder, her head was bowed, and she walked as slowly as if she were carrying the whole world on her back. "Sarah!" I shouted, waving my hand. The girl flinched, looked up for a second, and then looked down again. When she got closer, I almost froze. Her little face was pale, and her eyes were red and swollen, as if she had been crying. Her usual innocent smile was gone, and in its place was an expression of exhaustion, as if she were trying to hide something. I felt my heart shrink. A sharp pain shot up my chest. "Sarah, what's wrong, my love? Did something happen at school?" I asked her, taking her hand with a trembling voice. Sarah just shook her head without saying anything. Her little hand was cold in mine despite the scorching heat. I wanted to ask her more, but seeing her empty gaze, I preferred to swallow my questions. I squeezed her hand tightly and took her to the bus stop near the school. The whole way back, the girl sat close to me, hugging her backpack, without saying a single word. To everything I asked her, she just nodded or shook her head, her eyes fixed on the bus floor. The unease inside me grew and grew like a heavy stone on my chest. The door to Emily's house closed behind us, and the sound of the lock seemed to end a long and anxious day. I told the girl to take off her shoes, trying to keep my voice calm, but inside I was a bundle of nerves. Sarah stood there, hugging her backpack tightly, not bothering to lift her head. I went to the kitchen, prepared a glass of warm milk for her, and put it in front of her on the dining room table. Steam rose from the cup, but she didn't even touch it. She just sat there, her gaze lost on the floor, as if the whole weight of the world were on her thin little shoulders. I pulled up a chair and sat down next to her. I put a hand on her shoulder and spoke to her in the softest voice I could manage. "Sarah, my darling, tell your grandma what happened at school. Did someone make you feel bad?" I tried to smile, hoping my familiar face would encourage her to talk. But Sarah just shook her head, pressing her lips together, and her little hands gripped the backpack strap so tightly that her knuckles turned white. I wanted to insist, but seeing her red and swollen eyes, I held back. Something was very wrong. I knew it, but I didn't want to force her to talk if she wasn't ready. Suddenly, as if something inside her broke, Sarah let out a scream and burst into tears. Her cry was sharp, like a knife stabbing my heart. She began to tremble, shrugging her shoulders, and between choked sobs, she managed to say a few broken words. "Grandma, get me out of here. I'm so scared of my dad." Her voice was barely a whisper, but each word pierced my soul, leaving me frozen and not knowing what to do. "Dad, you mean Daniel. What are you afraid of? Tell me, my love." I tried to stay calm, but my voice was already shaking, and my heart was pounding like it was going to burst out of my chest. Sarah shook her head desperately as tears streamed down her cheeks. "I don't want to be here anymore. Grandma, please." She hugged me tightly, hiding her face in my chest, and I felt her warm breath on my blouse. I put my arms around her, patting her back, but I felt like I was suffocating. Daniel. The man I thought was a support for Emily Sarah's decent stepfather. I couldn't believe it, but the look of panic in Sarah's eyes was not something a 10-year-old girl could fake. I calmed her down. There, my love, it's over now. Your grandma is going to get you out of here. Don't be afraid, I'm here." But the truth was, I was scared too. Scared that what I was about to face was more than I could handle. There was no other choice. I decided to take Sarah to my house 3 blocks away. I took her hand, carried her heavy backpack, and we left Emily's house. Sarah walked beside me, dragging her feet with her head down. I didn't dare ask her more. I just squeezed her hand, trying to give her a little security. When we got to my house and the old wooden door closed, I could finally let out a breath. My house is small but cozy, full of memories of the days when David, my husband, was still alive. I took Sarah to the living room and sat her on the sofa. "Sit here, my love. I'll bring you a little glass of water, okay?" I said, forcing a cheerful tone. But Sarah was still hugging her backpack, not wanting to let it go. I sat next to her and carefully took her hands off it. "Relax, Sarah. It's just you and me here. No one is going to do anything to you." The girl hesitated, looked me in the eyes, and with trembling hands opened the zipper of her backpack. From inside, she took out a small black recorder, an old one, the kind that looks like a cheap toy. She put it on the coffee table. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking, and she whispered as if she was afraid someone else would hear her. "Grandma, listen to this." My heart skipped a beat. A bad feeling completely washed over me. I took the recorder with my cold fingers and pressed the play button. There was a buzz, then a click, like a door opening, and then Daniel's voice, deep, restrained, with a cold tone that chilled my blood. "Sarah, I'm home." Sarah's voice on the recording sounded weak and broken. "Dad, no, I'm scared." I felt the blood freeze in my veins. Daniel continued, his voice full of pressure like a threat. "If you tell your mom, she's going to leave you. You don't want your mom to be sad, do you? This is our secret." Sarah's sob was heard, a whimper so faint it broke my soul. He kept talking with a soft but false voice that made my skin crawl. "Be a good girl, don't resist. If you're bad, your mom will find out everything, and you'll lose her." The next sound was the creak of a chair, and then a muffled scream from Sarah, full of panic. "No, please, I don't want to." I was trembling from head to toe. The recorder slipped from my hands and fell on the table with a thud. But the audio continued. Daniel's voice became deeper, marking each word. "Shh, be quiet. If anyone finds out about this, everyone will hate you. They'll say you're a bad girl." The room seemed to freeze, but I wasn't listening anymore. My head was spinning, and an immense pain and rage rose in my chest, as if they were going to tear me apart from the inside. Sarah broke down crying, hiding her face on the table, her shoulders shaking with each sob every time there's no one home. "He touches me, Grandma. He always wants to touch me in places that tickle me," she said haltingly. "I've told my mom many times, but she doesn't believe me. She even scolded me for making things up." I ran to hug her, feeling my heart break into 1,000 pieces. "Oh, my little girl," I whispered as tears rolled down my cheeks. Trembling, I turned off the recorder. I couldn't stand it for another second. That sound, that voice, they were like stabs, one after another. "I'm so scared, Grandma. I don't want to live in that house anymore," Sarah sobbed, her face buried in my chest and her little hands clinging to my blouse. I hugged her, I comforted her, but I was trembling myself. Fear, rage, and a sense of helplessness were mixed inside me. Daniel, the man I thought was decent, the one I thought would bring Emily happiness, turned out to be a demon. And Sarah, my little granddaughter, had been enduring all this alone in the very house that was supposed to be her safest place. I gave Sarah a handkerchief to dry her face, trying to stay calm. "Don't be afraid, my love. Your grandma is here. I'm not going to let anyone hurt you again," I told her, although deep down I knew that from now on, nothing would be simple. I went to the kitchen, served her a plate of hot broth, and put it in front of her. "Eat a little, you need strength to be able to talk to your grandma." But Sarah just shook her head and snuggled closer to me, as if only there she felt safe. I sat there hugging her, watching her slowly fall asleep from exhaustion, her eyes swollen, her little hand still clinging to the recorder as if it were her last piece of evidence. I stroked her hair while the tears fell silently. Seeing Sarah sleep with her innocent face marked by pain, I knew that from that moment on, life for her and for me would no longer be peaceful. Night fell and my little house sank into silence, broken only by the constant ticking of the wall clock. Sarah slept beside me, her breathing irregular, her sleep anything but peaceful. I sat on the edge of the bed, gently stroking her silky hair. Each strand that slipped through my fingers reminded me of the days when she was a baby and would snuggle in my arms asking for a story. But now her innocent face was full of pain, and her swollen eyes still reflected fear. My heart felt heavy, as if a rock were crushing my chest. I picked up the phone, dialed Emily's number, my daughter. I wanted to ask her when she would be back. I wanted to tell her everything, to scream at her, so she would understand the pain her daughter was suffering. But the phone rang, and no one answered. I sighed, put the phone aside, and a sense of helplessness washed over me. Emily, so busy with her work, with her big projects, with the life she thought was happy next to Daniel. But didn't she see that Sarah, her own blood, was being destroyed inside that same house? Around 10 at night, Sarah woke up with a start. She looked around disoriented with a look of panic, as if she had just escaped from a nightmare. She hugged me tightly, her trembling little hands clinging to my clothes. "Grandma, I'm scared." Her voice was hoarse, weak, as if all her energy had been drained. "If my stepfather comes back and finds out I told you, he's going to scold me. What is he going to do to me now, Grandma?" Every word from Sarah was like a stab in my heart. I squeezed her shoulders, trying to make my voice sound calm, although inside I was boiling with rage and pain. "Don't worry, Sarah, I'm here. No one has the right to hurt you anymore, I promise." I helped Sarah sit up and carefully dried her tears. In a corner of the room, the recorder was still there like a silent, cold witness. I didn't even want to look at it, but I knew it was the only thing that proved Sarah's pain was not an invention. I looked for a small metal box, one of the ones David, my late husband, used to keep his little things in. I put the recorder inside and locked it with an old rusty key. "See," I told Sarah, forcing a smile, "your proof is safe. No one is going to take it from you." Sarah nodded. Her gaze seemed a little less scared, but she was still stuck to me as if I were her only refuge. I took her to the kitchen and heated up the plate of chicken broth that was left from the afternoon. The smell was delicious, but Sarah just looked at it without touching the spoon. "Eat a little." "Sarah," I insisted with a soft but firm voice, "you need strength so we can keep talking." The girl hesitated, took the spoon, but as soon as she brought it to her mouth, tears rolled down her cheeks again and fell into the plate. "Forgive me, Grandma," she whispered with a broken voice. I didn't want to worry you, but I didn't know what to do anymore. I felt a lump in my throat and tears escaped from my eyes too. I dried her face and drew her towards me. "You are not to blame for anything, my love. I am the one who asks for your forgiveness, for not having realized sooner, for not having protected you sooner." I put pajamas on her, an old one that belonged to Emily when she was a child, and that I still kept in the closet. She lay down next to me in the old wooden bed where David and I slept together so many nights. I rocked her, singing her a song in a low voice that I used to sing to Emily when she was little. Sarah's breathing calmed down, but I knew that sleep could not relieve the nightmares she carried inside. I lay back, closed my eyes, but my mind wouldn't stop. Old memories came back like a slow-motion movie. I remembered David, my good husband, who passed away more than 10 years ago from a sudden stroke. When he was alive, this house was always full of laughter. At that time, Emily had just married Michael, a hard-working and good young man who always looked at my daughter with eyes full of love. I still remember their wedding day, Emily, radiant in a simple white dress, and Michael so nervous holding her hand in front of the guests, his face red as a primary school boy. I was there with tears running down my face, not of sadness but of happiness, seeing that my daughter had found a good man. Then Sarah was born like a ray of sunshine that illuminated our family. I remember the first day I held her so small, snuggled in my arms, looking at me with her round eyes. David from the yard shouted inside, "Linda, I'm going to make a little wooden doll for the girl so she can play," and he set to carving with such care, making beautiful little dolls, and smiled happily seeing Sarah cling to her gift. In the afternoons, Michael would come home from work, and the first thing he would do was pick up his daughter, kiss her cheeks while Emily prepared dinner. I would sit and watch them, the whole family together, and my heart felt warm like I was basking in the sun. Those were the happiest days, simple but complete. Everything started to fall apart when David, my husband, passed away. A sudden stroke snatched him from me, leaving this little house empty like a shell. I still remember that day when the doctor called me to the emergency room and told me in a soft but cold voice, "We did everything we could, Mrs. Linda." I stood there with no strength in my legs, seeing David motionless in the bed. His good face was now just a shadow. I didn't cry at that moment, but when I got home, when I sat in the chair where he always sat, I broke down in tears. The house, which was once full of laughter, now only had the ticking of the clock, as if counting the days of my loneliness. Emily was also shaken by her father's death. She tried to be strong, but I saw the empty look in her eyes every time she entered the house. Michael was no better. He was a good, hard-working man who always wanted to give his wife and daughter a good life, but his work started to go badly. A close friend convinced him to invest in a business that promised great profits. I remember that night when Emily and Sarah were already asleep. Michael sat with me in the yard, his eyes full of worry. "Mother-in-law, I don't want my wife and daughter to suffer because of me," he told me with a deep but determined voice. "If this business works out, I'm going to give Emily and Sarah a bigger house, a life without worries." I advised him to be careful not to rush, that happiness was not in money. But Michael was young, full of ambitions, and perhaps he felt the pressure to prove that he was the man of the house. I couldn't blame him, but my heart was not at ease. Only a year later, everything came crashing down. The business failed, and Michael lost everything. Debt surrounded him like a storm. I saw Michael change from being an optimistic young man to a silent man, always with a heavy expression on his face. Once I found him sitting in the yard with a lost look, red eyes holding a cigarette. He wasn't smoking. Sarah, who was then barely 4 years old, ran to him and put a wildflower in his hand with an innocent smile that seemed to want to comfort him. Michael just hugged the girl tightly without saying anything, but I saw how his shoulders trembled. The debt collectors started coming to the house, knocking on the door loudly. Their shouts could be heard all over the street. The neighbors started whispering, pointing at Emily every time she passed. I saw my daughter getting more and more tired, trying to carry the whole family, while Michael sank into despair. One night, Michael called Emily and me to the living room. He stood there with his fists clenched and said with a trembling voice, "Emily, I don't want you and Sarah to suffer because of me. I think we should get a divorce." Emily froze, broke into tears, and hugged Michael, begging him to stay. "Don't go, Michael. We'll get through this together." But Michael just shook his head, his eyes full of pain. "I don't deserve you, Emily. I don't want to drag you down with me." Sarah, too young to understand, just stood in a corner watching her mom cry and her dad drag a suitcase to the door. I was there with my heart in pieces, but I couldn't do anything. I understood Michael. I understood that for him, leaving was the only way to protect Emily and Sarah from the weight of the debts. But seeing my daughter fall to the floor hugging Sarah and crying, I wanted to scream that it was all a mistake. Michael left, taking a piece of Emily and Sarah's heart with him and leaving a void that I knew would never be filled. After that day, the debt collectors stopped coming. Emily cut off all contact with Michael and threw herself completely into her work. She worked like crazy day and night at the office, as if only work could help her forget the pain. Not long after Emily got a raise and then a promotion, she decided to take Sarah to rent an apartment far from this house, full of memories of David and me. I supported her, but I couldn't help feeling sad. I saw Sarah less, only occasionally picking her up for the weekend. On those occasions, I saw that Sarah missed her dad, and she would ask me, "Grandma, where is my dad? Is he coming to play with me?" I could only hug her and lie, telling her that her dad was busy, but that he would come to visit soon. Michael, during those years, lived in silence, working tirelessly to pay off his debts. He didn't come to the house often for fear that the debt collectors would appear and bother Emily and Sarah. But I knew he never stopped loving Sarah. Once I saw him standing on the corner at a distance from Emily's house, watching the girl play in the yard. He didn't get closer. He just stood there, his eyes full of love and regret. I wanted to call him, tell him to come in, but I stopped myself for fear of complicating things further. In the years following Michael's departure, I saw Emily struggle to get ahead like a tree trying to grow in the middle of a storm. She took refuge in her work, spending days and nights at the architecture firm, as if only blueprints and contracts could help her forget the pain of having lost her father and her husband. Emily rose quickly, going from being just another employee to a trusted person, to her bosses in charge of important projects. I felt proud, but it also hurt me to see her. She was still young, barely in her 30s, but the sparkle in her eyes was gone. I knew that Emily was not only building a career, but that she also longed for a new home. A place where Sarah could grow up with love and where she herself would stop feeling alone. I still went to her house often to take care of Sarah on the days she came home late. Sarah, my granddaughter, was older now, but she was still a sensitive girl who loved to hug me and tell me things about school. In those moments, my heart felt light, but I couldn't help but worry. Emily was so busy that she barely had time to play with her daughter, and I feared that Sarah would feel lonely in her own home. I tried to make up for it, cooking her favorite dishes, telling her stories about her grandfather David, but always with a lump in my throat. A child needs her mom, her dad, and at that time Sarah only had me when Emily wasn't there, and then Daniel appeared. I still remember the first time Emily told me about him. Her voice sounded excited, as if she had found a light after so many dark days. "Mom, I met him at the company party," Emily told me with her eyes lit up. Daniel is a mature, very polite man, and he's very pleasant to talk to. He works in the finance department, and everyone really likes him. I smiled happy for her, but deep down I felt some reservation. After all the suffering with Michael, I only wished that Emily would find someone truly good, not just for her but also for Sarah. Over time, Daniel became a constant presence in Emily's house. Every time he came, he brought a basket of fresh fruit, or some little gift for Sarah, an ice cream, a little doll, a coloring book. I watched how Daniel spoke to Sarah in a soft voice, always joking to make her laugh. Once I went to visit and I found him changing a light bulb in the yard with sweat beading on his forehead. He looked up and smiled at me. "Don't worry, mother-in-law. The house repairs, leave them to me." That attitude reassured me a little. I thought that maybe Emily had finally found a man who cared about his family, someone who could give her the happiness she deserved so much. At first, Sarah was shy with Daniel. She used to hide behind me and barely forced a smile when he gave her a gift. But in front of Emily and me, Sarah seemed to open up little by little, or at least that's what I thought. Once I saw her eating an ice cream that Daniel had bought for her sitting in a corner with a smile on her face. I told myself that it was only a matter of time before Sarah got used to her stepfather. After all, the girls still missed Michael very much, her real dad. The few times Michael called to see how she was, Sarah would tell me excitedly with a cheerful little voice, like a little bird's. I didn't want to force her to forget Michael, but I also hoped that Daniel would be a good father, even if he couldn't replace him. Emily and Daniel's wedding was simple, but very warm. I remember that day Sarah wore a pastel pink dress and a small bouquet of flowers standing next to her mom in the church. She looked beautiful, but her gaze had a hint of sadness, as if she were trying to please her mother. Emily, on the other hand, was radiant. Her smile shone as brightly as the day she married Michael. I was sitting in one of the pews, with tears rolling down my cheeks, not of sadness, but of hope. I prayed silently, asking that this be a new beginning for my daughter, for Sarah, for our whole family. Daniel, with his polite air and confident smile, made me believe that he would bring peace to Emily and her daughter's life. After the wedding, Daniel moved into Emily's house. He behaved like a hard-working man, took Sarah to school, often stopped by my house to say hello, and even fixed the wooden door in Emily's kitchen that always creaked. I saw him as detail-oriented, attentive, and I began to think that I had worried for nothing. Once Daniel brought me a jar of honey, saying he had bought it in his hometown and knew I liked it. "Take care, Mrs. Linda," he told me with a sincere tone. I thanked him, feeling a relief in my heart. Maybe I thought Daniel really was a good man, but Emily was getting busier and busier. She took on more big projects, left early, and came back very late sometimes, even staying at the office on weekends. Daniel, for his part, began to travel a lot for work, leaving Sarah home alone more frequently. I began to worry. I was afraid the girl would feel lonely. One day, Emily called me. Her voice sounded exhausted. "Mom, I'm swamped with work." "I can't be attached to Sarah all the time. Could you come take care of her during the day?" I heard her voice and felt a mixture of pity and sadness. "Of course, dear, don't worry." "I'll take care of Sarah," I replied without hesitation. I loved Emily, but I loved Sarah more. A 10-year-old girl, no matter how strong she is, needs care and love. From that day on, a new routine was formed. Early in the morning, I would go to Emily's house, prepare Sarah's breakfast, and take her to school. In the afternoon, I would pick her up, make her lunch, and ask her how her day had been. At night, I would return to my house with a happy heart for having been with Sarah, but also heavy-hearted seeing that she talked less every day. There were days when I noticed that Sarah forced a smile and her gaze would wander when I mentioned Daniel. "Do you have fun with your stepfather?" I would ask, trying to sound casual. Sarah would just shake her head and whisper, "Everything's fine, Grandma." I felt a lump in my throat, but I didn't dare insist. I told myself that maybe she still wasn't used to Daniel, especially since she still missed Michael so much. Tonight, after the truth came out, I could barely sleep. My eyes were irritated, but sleep wouldn't come. The recording of Daniel's voice kept playing in my head. Each cold word, each sob from Sarah were like stabs in my heart. I was lying next to my granddaughter, seeing her innocent face trapped in a restless sleep, and I felt my soul hanging by a thread. The next morning, I tried to act normal. I took Sarah to school like any other day. The girl was silent, not saying anything, just squeezing my hand the whole way. I smiled at her, pretending everything was fine, but inside, I knew I was preparing for a battle. The recorder was in my old cloth bag like a ticking time bomb. I left Sarah in her classroom, watching her walk slowly, her heavy backpack making one shoulder lower than the other. "Be good, my love," I told her, forcing a sweet voice. Sarah just nodded her gaze, still full of anguish. I turned around with my heart in pieces, and I promised myself that today I would confront Emily, even if it meant destroying what was left of our family. Emily didn't get home until late. I decided to stay, although normally I would have been at my house by that time. I sat at the dining room table clutching my cloth bag, feeling a fire inside but trying to stay calm. When Emily came in, I saw she was exhausted with dark circles under her eyes. She quickly took off her heels and threw her purse on the sofa. "Mom, you haven't left yet," she asked. Her voice sounded surprised, but she couldn't hide her fatigue. I didn't answer right away. I just got up and pointed to a chair. "Sit down, Emily. I need to talk to you." Sarah was sitting next to me, silently hugging her backpack with her head down. I took the recorder out of my bag, put it on the table, and with trembling fingers pressed the play button. The buzzing sound was heard, and then Daniel's voice, cold and terrifying. "Sarah, I'm home." Sarah's voice between sobs answered on the recording. "Dad, no, I'm scared." And then Daniel's threatening voice. "If you tell your mom, she's going to leave you. This is our secret." Every word was like a stab, not just for me. I saw how Emily froze her eyes wide, clinging to the edge of the table. But then, as if she didn't want to believe it, Emily frowned and dismissed it with a wave of her hand. "Impossible. This is a fabrication. Sarah, you hate your stepfather, and that's why you made all this up, right?" Her voice was harsh, as if she were trying to deny the truth in front of her. I looked at her in disbelief. "Emily!" I almost shouted at her, my voice trembling with rage. "Don't you hear that it's Daniel's voice? She's a 10-year-old girl. How is she going to make something like this up?" I pointed to the recorder, my hand trembling, feeling my blood boil. Emily turned red, stood up abruptly, and her voice became a scream. "Then you explain it to me. How would a girl know how to record something like that? Sarah is always asking to go with Michael. I'm sure he convinced her." "Michael is jealous of Daniel. He wants to destroy this family. Even before I married Daniel, Michael would call me to make up gossip and speak ill of him." I froze and asked her, "What did Michael tell you about Daniel, Emily?" Furious told me that ever since Daniel started frequenting the house, Michael had called her to tell her that a former co-worker of Daniel's had warned him that he was not a good person, that he had a murky past. "Michael is jealous because I found happiness again," Emily shouted. "He wants to ruin my family, and that's why he used Sarah to do this." I contained my anger and turned to Sarah. The girl was trembling, her eyes full of tears, and her little hands were clinging to my arm. "I told you, Grandma," Sarah sobbed with a broken voice. "I had already told my mom many times, but she never believed me." Her crying broke my soul. I hugged her tightly, feeling her little body tremble in my arms. "Don't be afraid, my love. I'm here," I whispered, but my eyes were still fixed on Emily as if I wanted to burn her blindness with my gaze. Emily jumped up, her hands trembling, and pointed at Sarah. "It was surely Michael. He has always wanted to turn her against me. He wants her to hate Daniel." Her voice broke as if she were trying to convince herself. I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed the table hard and shouted, "Emily, you're so blind you can't see how your own daughter is suffering." The blow echoed in the room, making it tremble. The atmosphere became so tense it was hard to breathe. Only Sarah's muffled sob could be heard, a small but sharp sound like a plea for help. I hugged her tightly, looking directly into Emily's eyes. I felt an immense fury, but also a deep pain. Emily, my daughter, the one I raised and loved all my life, now chose to believe a man instead of her own daughter. "Listen to me carefully, Emily," I said, my voice low but firm. "This is not a fabrication. It's the truth. It's Sarah's pain, and if you don't believe her, then I will protect her myself." I squeezed Sarah's hand, feeling its faint warmth, as a reminder that I couldn't leave her alone for a single second more. The kitchen in Emily's house felt heavy, as if the air had become thick after the argument. Emily was standing, arms crossed, her face red, and her breathing ragged, as if fighting to contain her anger or her own confusion. I was still sitting next to Sarah, patting her back gently, feeling her little body still trembling under my hand. Sarah's sobs were like stabs in my heart, filling me with pain and rage. I took a deep breath, looked at Sarah's swollen eyes, and asked her as sweetly as possible, "Tell me the truth, my love. Where did you get that recorder?" I needed to know, not because I doubted her, but to understand everything, to be sure I had the whole truth in my hands. Sarah hesitated, her little hands fidgeting with the strap of her backpack, her head bowed. Suddenly she burst into tears with more force, her cry echoed in the silent kitchen as if she were breaking everything. "Grandma," she sobbed with a broken voice. "A few weeks ago, when I saw my dad, I was crying. I only dared to tell him that my stepfather punished me a lot, that I was afraid of him. My dad didn't ask me any more questions, he just gave me this little thing. He told me that if I ever felt in danger, I should press the red button." Sarah's words hit me like a hammer blow. I froze, still hugging her, but my head was spinning. Michael. The father who had distanced himself, who had suffered so much to protect them, was he the one who had given his daughter the tool to defend herself? I felt a mixture of pain and gratitude. Michael, even though he was no longer with them, was still looking for a way to protect his daughter. But before I could say anything, Emily interrupted me with a harsh voice, as if she wanted to vent all her anger. "There it is. It was Michael who taught her to make everything up he wants to destroy this family." Emily's eyes shone with fury, and she pointed at Sarah as if she were the culprit of everything. Sarah, scared, clung to my blouse and shook her head desperately. "No, my dad didn't tell me to make anything up," she shouted, her voice hoarse from crying so much. "I just recorded it." "I didn't want my stepfather to do that to me anymore. I was very scared, Grandma." That grandma was like a plea that made it impossible for me to hold back the tears. I hugged her tighter, feeling her little body shake in my arms. "Don't be afraid, Sarah," I whispered with a broken voice. "Your grandma believes you. I'm not going to let anyone hurt you again." I turned to Emily, and the rage inside me erupted like a fire. "Emily, don't you hear what the machine recorded?" I almost shouted at her, pointing to the small recorder on the table. "The girl is crying. What child can act so well? Do you think Sarah, a 10-year-old girl, would make up something so horrible just to harm Daniel?" I couldn't believe that Emily, my own daughter, chose to side with a man instead of her own blood. Emily clung to the edge of the table. Her nails dug into the wood with such force that I heard the sound. She looked at Sarah. Her eyes wavered, but her mouth remained stubborn. "No. It's all Michael's fault. I'm sure he taught her to say all that." Her voice trembled, as if she were trying to convince herself more than me. I shook my head, incredulous of her blindness. "Emily, you're fooling yourself," I told her with a low but sharp voice. "Don't you see the pain on her face? Don't you hear her crying on the recording? That's not acting, it's the truth." Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She jumped up and shouted in desperation, "You never believe me, I've told you many times, but you only believe my stepfather." "You've never believed me. I hate you." Her words were like a knife, not just for Emily, but for me too. The girl trembled from head to toe with tears streaming down her face, and suddenly she collapsed in my arms, as if all her strength had been exhausted. I panicked, held her, and shook her gently. "Sarah, my love, wake up." My heart was beating a mile a minute. Fear rose in my throat as if it were going to choke me. Emily stood paralyzed with her hands trembling and took a few steps back as if she had been slapped. She looked at Sarah, then at me, her eyes red but still stubborn. I didn't know." She stammered, her voice lost, but I no longer had the patience to listen to her. "You didn't know," I shouted at her, my voice echoing in the kitchen. "You didn't know what your daughter was suffering. You chose to believe Daniel, you chose your pride instead of listening to Sarah's plea." I hugged her tightly, feeling her weak breath, and my heart broke. Quickly I laid Sarah on the sofa, took a damp cloth to clean her face, and looked for a small bottle of old alcohol in my bag to rub on her temples. The strong smell spread, and I just hoped it would help her react. A moment later her eyelids fluttered open, but her gaze was still frightened, as if the nightmare wouldn't let her go. "Grandma," she whispered with a weak voice, clinging to my blouse. I hugged her and tried to sound sweet. "I'm here. My love, don't be afraid." I turned to Emily, my daughter, who was standing there, pale, with her hands trembling. "If you're not going to protect Sarah, I will—" I told her, my voice trembling with rage. "You no longer deserve to be her mother." My words were like a knife, sharp and merciless. I didn't want to hurt Emily, but seeing Sarah trembling in my arms, I couldn't forgive her blindness. Emily stepped back, her eyes full of tears but still stubborn. "Mom, don't say that. It's just that I didn't want to look bad. I didn't want people to talk." Her voice broke as if she were begging me to understand her. I interrupted her with a voice as hard as steel. "Look bad, your pride is not more important than your daughter's life and honor." I pointed at Sarah, my hand trembling. "The girl pleaded with you. She told you so many times, but you chose to believe Daniel. You chose your appearance of happiness instead of your own blood." I almost screamed, no longer able to contain myself. Emily stood there, her shoulders slumped, but I no longer had the patience to console her. I had already lost David. I had already lost my family's happiness. I couldn't let Sarah suffer for a second longer. Without hesitation, I took out my phone and dialed Michael's number. His voice sounded on the other end worried. "Mother-in-law, what happened? Why are you calling me so suddenly?" I took a deep breath, trying to calm my voice. "Come to Emily's house right now. It's something very serious. It has to do with Sarah." I didn't say more. I hung up, feeling a fire in my chest. Michael, even though he had distanced himself, was still the girl's father. I knew he wouldn't hesitate to come when he knew his daughter was in danger. Less than 2 hours later, Michael appeared at the door. He was thinner than the last time I saw him, with his hair disheveled, but his gaze was firm, as if he were ready to face anything. He had a folder under his arm, but what caught my attention the most was his expression of contained anguish, as if he already sensed something terrible. As soon as Emily saw Michael, she became enraged and shouted at him, "What are you doing here? This is none of your business anymore." She stood in front of him, as if she wanted to protect her territory. Michael stood firm, looking her directly in the eyes, and said, marking each word, "Sarah is my daughter, and I have the right to protect her. I made the mistake of letting her go once, but I will never ignore her when she's in trouble." His words sounded like a declaration of war, not against Emily, but against everything that had hurt Sarah. I saw that his eyes were red, not from weakness, but from the rage and pain of a father. Sarah burst into tears, broke away from my arms, and ran to hug Michael, burying her face in his chest and saying between sobs, "I want to go with you, Dad. I don't want to go back to this house. I hate my mom. I hate my stepfather." The girl's crying filled the room, breaking the air. Michael hugged her tightly, stroking her hair, and told her with a broken voice, "I'm here, Sarah. I'm not going to let you be afraid anymore." I stood there with tears running down my face, feeling a small comfort in seeing that Sarah had found a refuge, but at the same time it hurt me to see my family break apart once more. Michael looked up and looked at me confused. I didn't say anything. I just silently took the recorder and pressed the play button. Daniel's voice echoed cold and terrifying. Every word was like a stab. Michael's face changed quickly from confusion to horror, and finally to fury. When the recording ended, he jumped up with his fists clenched and turned to Emily, shouting so loud it seemed like he was going to break something. I may have failed Emily, but I never turned my back on Sarah. "You, on the other hand, left her in the hands of a monster." Michael's words were sharp, like a direct slap to Emily's face. Sarah let go of Michael and stood there with her eyes red, staring at her mother. Her voice trembled, but it was full of resentment. "Mom, I put up with it for a long time. It wasn't once or twice, it was many times. When you weren't there, when it was just him and me, I was very scared. I told you, I begged you to believe me, but you only scolded me. You told me I was making it up, that I hated my stepfather, and that's why I was telling lies. Every time you did that, I felt like nobody cared." Sarah's words were like a flood that washed away everything. I put my arms around her, tears running down my face. I couldn't contain the pain. Michael squeezed her hand. His eyes were also red, as if he were holding himself back from going out to find Daniel right that moment. Emily was trembling, tears falling nonstop. Her face was pale. She looked at Sarah, then at me, and stammered, "No, it can't be. I'm a bad mother." Her voice broke as if the truth had finally overcome her blindness. I stood in front of her, looked her in the eyes, and told her firmly, "You chose to believe a man instead of your own daughter. That is the worst sin If you don't side with Sarah today, then from now on you cease to be my daughter." My words were like an axe blow, merciless, but I didn't regret them. I had already lost too much, and I couldn't let Sarah continue to suffer. Emily burst into tears, falling to the floor, covering her face with her hands. "Mom, forgive me. I didn't know." She sobbed, but I just stood there hugging Sarah with a heavy heart. Michael picked up Sarah and whispered something in her ear while I watched, knowing that the truth could no longer be denied. The room felt frozen. Only Emily's crying, Michael's whisper, and the painful beat of my heart could be heard. I stood up and said in a firm voice, "We have to take Sarah to the hospital right now. She needs to be checked." Michael nodded and picked up Sarah immediately, his gaze full of determination. Emily, pale, just followed us in silence, like a shadow full of regret. The taxi ride to the hospital seemed eternal. Sarah was snuggled against Michael with her eyes closed and her hands clinging to her dad's shirt. I was beside her trying to stay calm, but I felt my heart in a knot. Emily was in the front seat in silence with her hands clasped tightly and her gaze lost out the window. No one said anything, but the atmosphere was so heavy I felt like I was suffocating. I just wanted to hug Sarah, tell her that everything would be okay, but I knew that words of comfort were no longer enough to heal the pain she had endured. In the pediatric emergency room, a young doctor received us. He had a kind face and spoke in a soft but professional voice. "How is the little one?" he asked while taking notes and observing Sarah. The girl hid behind Michael, not daring to look around as if she were afraid that anyone would touch her. I sat next to her, patted her on the back and whispered, "Your grandma is here. Sarah, don't be afraid." But every time I saw her frightened eyes, my heart sank. The doctor examined her carefully, asked her some questions, but she just shook her head with her lips pressed together. I saw Michael clench his fists as if holding back his anger. After a while, the doctor called Michael and me into the hallway. Emily remained seated, covering her face, her shoulders trembling. "The girl shows signs of having been physically assaulted," the doctor said in a grave voice. "In addition, she is in a state of severe psychological crisis. She will need long-term treatment, both physical and mental." His words were like a knife that confirmed my worst fear. I felt my legs give out, but Michael held me up. His eyes were red, but his gaze was firm. "Thank you, doctor," he said with a broken voice. "We will do everything necessary to help her." When we returned to the room, Emily jumped up and burst into tears. "Oh my God, Sarah," she muttered, as if the truth had finally crushed her blindness. I didn't say anything. I just looked at her, feeling a mixture of rage and pity. The doctor asked us more about what had happened, and I, without hesitation, took out the recorder and gave it to him. "Listen to this," I told him with a trembling voice. When Daniel's voice echoed cold and terrifying, the doctor frowned and began to write faster. At the end of the recording, he looked at us and said seriously, "This is very serious. I suggest you contact the authorities immediately." We didn't think twice and went to the police station near the hospital. The atmosphere at the public prosecutor's office was serious. It smelled of old coffee and papers. An officer took Sarah to a private room along with a social worker to calm her down and talk to her. Sarah squeezed my hand before she left her gaze, pleading with me not to leave her. "I'll be right here, Sarah," I told her, forcing a smile. "You don't have to be afraid anymore." But when the door closed, I felt my heart clench. Michael, Emily, and I gave our statements one by one. I told everything from when Sarah arrived with red eyes to the horrible recording. Michael added, his voice full of fury, how he had given Sarah the recorder to protect herself. Emily sat in silence, just nodding when they asked her questions, while the tears fell without making a sound. When they played the recording in the evidence room, the officers looked at each other gravely. A commander, a tall and burly man, nodded. "We will act immediately. This subject is too dangerous. He cannot be on the street for another day." His words were a ray of hope, but they also gave me chills. Daniel, the man I had trusted, was now a danger I could not have foreseen. Hearing that Emily collapsed in her chair, covering her face and whispering, "Oh my God, how blind I was." She cried, but I no longer had the strength to console her. I just wanted Sarah to be safe to heal. The police planned to arrest Daniel that same night as soon as he returned from his business trip. They also placed a patrol car outside Emily's house in case he appeared suddenly. Very late at night, we returned to my house. Sarah fell asleep on the sofa, her forehead still beaded with cold sweat. I put a blanket over her and sat next to her with my eyes red. Seeing her there so small and fragile, I couldn't hold back the tears. "You didn't deserve to go through this," I whispered, stroking her hair. Michael was sitting in a corner without taking his eyes off Sarah, as if he were afraid she would disappear if he stopped looking at her. Emily went to the kitchen in silence to wash the dishes, but I knew she wasn't focused. Her face was a picture of sadness, and her hands trembled as she held the plates. Finally, she turned to me and said in a low voice, "Mom, forgive me." I didn't believe Sarah. I looked at her with a heavy heart. I wanted to hug her, tell her I understood, but I couldn't. "You have to ask Sarah for that apology, not me," I replied with a harsh voice that didn't hide my pain. Emily lowered her head, and her tears fell to the floor. I knew she was sorry, but I also knew that the wound in Sarah's heart would not be easy to heal. Around 11 at night, my phone rang. A deep male voice sounded on the other end, brief but clear. "Mrs. Linda, we have already detained Daniel at the airport." I let out a breath, but my heart was still pounding, as if I had just woken up from a nightmare. I hung up and looked at Sarah, who was sleeping soundly on the sofa, her little face still with a trace of cold sweat. I tucked her in, sat next to her, and felt a mixture of relief and heaviness. Justice was on its way, but the wounds in Sarah's soul would need much more than a sentence to heal. The next morning, the news about Daniel spread like wildfire. The morning news showed his picture handcuffed with his head bowed and his hair disheveled with no trace of the polite appearance I knew. Social media exploded with posts of outrage and comments demanding justice for Sarah. The newspapers called him the devil in a suit, and every word was like a stab to the trust I once had in him. I sat in front of the television with my fists clenched, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and pain. Satisfaction because Daniel could not escape, but pain for all that Sarah had had to suffer. The day of the first trial arrived like a whirlwind. I sat in the front row and I felt my heart sink when I saw Daniel enter in the orange prison uniform, disheveled, and with his head bowed as if he wanted to hide from all the gazes. The man I once thought would be a refuge for Emily was now just a guilty shadow. Emily was sitting next to me, not daring to look up, with her hands clasped and tears falling silently. I didn't look at her, not out of anger, but because I didn't want my emotions to weaken me. Today was for Sarah, and I had to be strong. Fortunately, Sarah was allowed not to face him directly. Instead, the recording and the doctor's report were presented in court. When Daniel's voice echoed in the room, cold and terrifying, everyone froze. I heard the murmurs of the people, the gasps of indignation. The doctor's report, with the details about Sarah's physical and psychological state, made me bite my lip to keep from crying. Emily couldn't contain herself and broke into sobs, but I just squeezed her hand without saying anything. I knew that Emily was paying the price for her blindness, but it was not the time for reproaches. When the sentence was delivered, a very harsh sentence, the whole room applauded. Daniel was found guilty, and I knew that justice had been done. But when he was taken out of the courthouse, the crowd outside threw eggs, rotten vegetables, and even garbage at him. They shouted at him with voices full of hatred. "Pay for what you did, demon!" I stood there watching that scene with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction because Daniel was getting what he deserved, but sadness because none of that would erase the dark days that Sarah lived. Emily became the center of criticism after the trial. The newspapers called her the blind mother. The neighbors whispered and even avoided her on the street. Once I heard Mrs. Rose, my lifelong neighbor, whisper to another person, "How is it possible that a mother doesn't believe her daughter and lets her suffer like that?" I wanted to defend Emily, to say that she had also been a victim of her own blindness, but I couldn't. Emily accepted everything in silence, as if it were the price she had to pay. "Mom, I deserve it," she told me once, her voice full of regret. I just nodded without answering, because I knew that only time and her actions could repair her mistake. Sarah moved in with me. My little house, which felt so empty since David died, was now filled again with her voice. I tried to create a safe space for her, a place where she could laugh without fear. Shortly after, a psychologist contacted me offering to help Sarah for free, moved by her story. "The girl needs to heal," she told me with a warm voice. I accepted, immediately grateful that there were still good people willing to help. Little by little, Sarah began to open up. She went back to school and I saw her smile return, although it was still fragile. Her teachers and classmates were wonderful. They encouraged her, gave her paper flowers. They made themselves with simple messages like, "Sarah, you are very strong," or "Keep it up, we are here with you." Every time Sarah came home with one of those flowers, I saw how her eyes lit up, as if little rays of sun were seeping into her heart. Michael, after paying all his debts, came to visit Sarah frequently. He took her to the park. We cooked simple meals together, but full of laughter. Sarah clung to her dad like before, excitedly telling him things about school, about her new teacher, or the boy who sat next to her. Seeing them together, I felt my soul rest, as if a piece of the old happiness were returning. Michael had also changed. He was no longer the silent, repentant man of before. "Mother-in-law, I'm not going to let Sarah suffer ever again," he told me once with a firm voice. I nodded, knowing he was trying to amend the mistakes of the past. Emily, who now lived alone, went to work in silence and came to visit Sarah on weekends. She learned to be patient. She was no longer as stubborn as before. But Sarah was still reserved, and in her gaze there was still a distance when she saw her mother. Once Emily brought her a cake, her favorite, and told her shyly, "I made this for you. Do you want to try it?" Sarah nodded, but she didn't smile. She just took a piece and ate slowly. I knew the wound in her heart was not easy to heal, but at least I saw that she no longer avoided her mother completely. One afternoon, I was sitting in the yard watching Sarah run after some little birds, and her crystal-clear laughter sounded like little bells in the sunset. I felt an immense peace, but I also reminded myself, only when we believe in a child's voice can we truly save them from the darkness. I was about to lose Sarah, about to let her sink into a pain that no one listened to. But now, seeing her laugh, I knew that I had kept the promise I made to her, to David, and to myself. Although the road ahead was long, I would always be here to protect Sarah so that she could find the light in her life again. I have been through everything, from pain to fury, and now that I look back, I just want to tell everyone one thing. Never underestimate the voice of a child. Their fear, their tears, and their pleas are never inventions to bother adults. I saw my own granddaughter collapse in pain because of the blindness and selfishness of the people who should have protected her. But in the end, justice came. That demon, disguised as a stepfather, had to pay a high price before the law, and my daughter will have to live the rest of her life with regret. The message I want to leave with this story is this: true love is not about protecting pride or reputation, but about protecting the safety and dignity of our loved ones, especially children. And for those with an evil heart like Daniel's, the only end they deserve is the severe punishment of society and the eternal contempt of all. The story you have just heard has been modified in names and places to protect the identity of the people involved. We do not tell this to judge, but in the hope that someone will listen and stop to reflect. How many mothers are suffering in silence inside their own home, I really wonder. If you were in my place, what would you do? Would you choose to remain silent to keep the peace, or would you dare to face everything to regain your voice? I want to know your opinion, because every story is like a candle that can light the way for someone else. God always blesses, and I am convinced that courage leads us to better days. In the meantime, on the final screen, I leave you two of the channel's most beloved stories. I'm sure they will surprise you. Thank you for staying with me until this moment.